To this seminar this afternoon, which is the first seminar for PEFM, or the Political Economy and Financial Markets Programme, for this term, indeed for this year. And for those who may not be familiar with this programme, it has two strands. One, analysing the reform of financial markets and immediate restructuring in the wake of the financial crisis, and the other focuses more specifically on the question of ethics in financial markets and changes that may be required. And today we're going to look at that progress on that strand with David Vines and Nick Morris. David is Professor of Economics here at Oxford, fellow at Balliol, and is also the acting director of this programme. Nick Morris has worked with David for many years, I think. Is now an associate of PEFM, and you co-founded London Economics.
I did.
At the very beginning. Yeah. So, and you're also
the mid-80s.
The deputy director of the IFS.
Yes.
Well, so he goes back quite a long way.
How about that for an introduction?
Wonderful.
And anyway, both of them have embarked on this project and already produced one book, which is
There we are.
Capital Failure, which we launched, I think, about
A year ago.
a year ago.
Yeah.
And they're going to tell you about progress that they've been making in this work since that launch. And David, you're going to start.
That's right. Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk about this work. And to welcome Natalie Gold with us, who's here sitting in the front row with the newest member of her family. Natalie is the author of one of the chapters in this book and is part of the research group that's taking our work forward. We've had a lot of interest expressed in our book, and roughly speaking, everybody has said to us, well, very interesting, what are you going to do about it? And this enterprise is our attempt to answer that question. We started off as an interdisciplinary group deliberately, and that's how Natalie came to be involved with our work, but also there was in this book some historical work, partly done by the person who's now the economics editor of The Economist, and also by Nick and others on history, so philosophy and history with accountants and other financial market practitioners, really interdisciplinary work, trying to ask from a framework as encompassing as we could find usefully to use, what we could answer to that question, what are you going to do next? So that's to say practical guidelines on how to achieve the necessary change. If we were asked what actually we were trying to do, we would describe it roughly in the following way. And really this has as its origins the paper that Natalie wrote for us. The idea that without appropriate motivations, even if people are promised to behave well, or that's to say simulate behaving in what you might call a professional manner, this is likely to unravel, risk of cheating, and also things unexpectedly change. But this is a view that it goes right back to Econ 101, and part of the answer to the question, what are you going to do about it, is try and encourage people to think in a different way from Econ 101, and that'll become very clear in what we've got to say. The essential idea on which all this is build is that not just being trustworthy, but being strongly trustworthy is an essential part of the reform of the financial system that we need. Relying on other regarding obligations, which are manifest through quite possibly altruism, but less demandingly than that, of the desire for approbation or esteem. That's the first idea that I really gained from Natalie. And the second comes right back to the very early work that she did on experimental economics, that framing is important in this work, encouraging people to think about circumstances in ways which engage their sense of obligation to others. And there's a relatively little sense of other regarding obligations that you need if you're producing baked beans, although they've got to be not poisonous and there's food standards. But you need a much larger sense of that concern for others if you're being a doctor, probably an architect, and we would argue someone in the financial services industry. Which bit of the financial services industry, and rather different from the baked beans idea, in which way become important questions. Just like the sense of obligations that a surgeon has will be rather different from those which a GP has. These are finely detailed requirements. And part of the work that we're going to do, I regard this as a bit of fun, is to go back to the history of economic thought. It goes right back to Bentham and Adam Smith, the famous Adam Smith problem, that for some aspects of everyday life, Smith thought you do not rely on the other regardingness of others, but on their pursuit of their own selfish interest. But in the theory of moral sentiments, there's a very different sense of what the community of people is and how they relate to people. And my sense of a lot of fun is that Econ 101 comes ultimately from Bentham trying to make sense of this Smith problem. Smith is a bit like Keynes, wonderful to read, quite deliberately ambiguous in many ways, and the sorting out it took a long to get from Smith to Bentham to the fundamental first theorem of welfare economics took 150 years of sorting out, but it's left economists with this particular view of the world, which is, we would argue, not helpful for the financial industry and needs in some ways to be changed. What do we say about strong trust and how to encourage it? Although economists think about trustworthiness as coming from repeated game theory by selfish individuals, self-regarding individuals acting in selfish ways, philosophers and more or less everybody else has this other sense of what is required, which you can describe using the words competence. You wouldn't trust somebody to do something if you just know they weren't able to. They also need to be able to understand the world they're in and tell you the truth, because and that's as they see it, but also to be well enough trained in empirical observation, right through to econometrics, to be able to understand what the world truthfully. And they need to be people who will keep promises when made. The bottom point on the slide is that this claim that a move in the direction we're describing is necessary is a contentious claim. There are strong defenders, excuse my phone, there are strong defenders of Econ 101 at a very high abstract level amongst game theorists. And one of the aspects of this history of economic thought work we want to do is to try and understand at as deep a level as we can the claims by many game theorists from Abjid Banerjee onwards that focal points of games pursued by selfish individuals might stand duty for the kind of other regarding obligations that we are seeking to call upon, namely that life is very complicated and so are games and so are repeated games, and it may be that the focal points of those games which emerge are very similar to the kinds of things that we're seeking from other regarding obligations. I throw that away as a footnote. We'll have more to say on that after a meeting we're hoping to organise in the next year or 18 months. Now, to do this, where this consists of ensuring competence, truth-telling and promise-keeping, requires framework of policy action. And we think that a way of thinking about how to encourage through institutional structures and policy intervention can be best described by this four-part framework, in which it's clear who is obliged to do what. It's clear what the responsibilities are that go with those obligations. It's clear that there are mechanisms available to the person that has been identified with this obligation and responsibility to actually do what they're required to achieve it. And finally, that there are procedures that hold to account those who are identified in this way. Obligations, responsibilities, mechanisms, and accountability. And Chris Alsop and I would tell you from a very different context, work we've been doing in macroeconomics. Things work when it's clear who's responsible for what. And this is a framework of trying to articulate an understanding of who's responsible for what and how they're held accountable for that responsibility. And this operates at three levels. At the level of the individual, at the level of the corporate firm, and socially. And so you can see that I'm describing what's effectively a 4x3 matrix. At the level of the individual, the firm, and the society, there are obligations, responsibilities, mechanisms, and holding to account that you can identify and carry out. At the individual level, the way we need to think about these issues involves psychology, behavioural economics, moral philosophy, and certainly ethics. At the corporate level, essentially corporate governance is what's in play. And at the social level, economists think about general equilibrium of the society and the theorem of welfare economics and Arrow's discussion of how difficult political decisions are to reach to get to best outcomes. But there are legal and regulatory structures in place at the society level which, if you like, provide an overarching framework in which corporate activities going upwards take place, and beneath that individual actions take place of those working in the corporations. So this is the framework that we're seeking to achieve. There is a lot of words there, and I will be talking, and Nick will be talking about these words in detail, but to give you an idea at the level of the individual, there are obligations about acting in a professional manner, and we'll talk a great deal of detail about what professional manner means, not cheating, not misleading, respecting fiduciary duties, and so on. At the level of the firm, there are responsibilities which relate to second row, second column, complying with legal obligations, regulatory requirements, safety, appropriate products, limiting acquisition of risk. You can see that we're assembling a set of requirements at many levels, and you're tempted to say this is actually all quite complicated, and it is. And I grew up in Econ 101, a discipline which has spent 200 years turning this kind of complexity into some very, very simple ideas. And part of the task at hand is to understand, looking out from those simple ideas, what else you need to do. And that's encapsulated in this picture. Now let's think at the individual level. Remember that I'm going to be talking about that, and then I'm going to hand over to Nick, who will talk about the corporate level and society at large. Keep in mind obligations, responsibilities, mechanisms, and holding to account. Now, I'm going to be talking about a sequence of things which relate to those 4 steps. And I think I best not describe the words at the bottom there, but just now set about discussing this 4-part strategy: obligations, responsibilities, mechanisms, and holding to account at the level of the individual working in the financial industry. My view of the way to proceed is to think of what's required as being describable as a greater degree of professionalism than what we've seen up to now in the financial services industry. Of course, being a professional like a doctor requires specialized knowledge, skills, and a knowledge base. But more than that, providing a service as a doctor involves an ongoing relationship with your clients, built on a sense of concern for the interests of the clients, carried out with integrity. You might say that having a jab for tetanus isn't like that, but having a treatment of cancer or psychotherapy or many other things just are. There's a spectrum in which that set of obligations and responsibilities is evident. And these relationships between provider and client need to be carried out with integrity, a word that economists find difficult to use but is important in describing the nature of these relationships. It's important also that a professional person be sufficiently broad-minded, well-educated and broad-minded as to be able to bring good judgment to bear on the relationship that that person has. Of course, they need to be independent of other interests being brought to bear upon them, and sometimes they need to be able to speak up for the activity in public and defend it, that final point about a voice in public discourse. Now, you can see that what we're looking for is how to achieve this for individuals in the financial industry. I should step back slightly and say, I hope that you, like me, have in the back of your mind the 57 books we've read about the scandalous behaviour and this, that, the other kind in the financial system. That's what's in the back of my head. And seeking a framework in which pressure can be brought to bear to to constrain that behaviour at the individual level is what we're seeking to do. As I've already said, and what Natalie has pointed out to us, framing matters hugely. Whether you regard a particular activity as something in which you have an obligation is important to how you carry it out. So someone who's a bond trader will have a different set of commitments and responsibilities than someone who is a pension manager for a vulnerable 73-year-old who is not clear how to manage their money. And there's a spectrum of different kinds of obligations from one end to the other. And norms of behaviour are essentially about categorising and describing and categorising the necessary obligations in relation to whatever it is that you're doing. We've said often, Nick and I, that if you're a bond trader, probably making sure that caveat emptor can be really made to work, that's to say, it is all you can hope for. These bonds actually have to relate to true pieces of. There is a company for which this is a bond. Buyer beware about everything, but do not attempt deceit in what you're providing. At the other end, very complex ideas in fiduciary duty of putting the client's interests in first position and making sure that your own interests don't interfere with the interests of the client. And all in between those two along a spectrum. It's clear, and we all know, and I'm saying something very obvious, but it's worth bringing in at this point, that financial incentives have worked against professionalism in undermining the identification. Is it all right for me to get away with this? You ask yourself. Well, you know, and I'm stepping outside the slide here to say something important. Other people do this and don't bother. I won't bother either. And Dan Susskind, sitting in the audience with us, wrote his MPhil thesis about that question of moral contagion, the sense that you care about a responsibility in ways which are influenced by the way in which others around you care about that responsibility. In a world in which this set of responsibilities is important, the position that individuals find themselves in needs to be well managed. Nick will talk some more about this when talking about the firm and the level of society, but we had a number of meetings 6 months ago with people in Barclays in which it was described to us how promotion and not just promotion but yearly bonuses and rewards were calibrated not just on the amount of money brought in but on how it was done. Complex to do in a big firm employing 140,000 people, how it was done in an industrially large number of people to manage is difficult to. Nevertheless, that's a necessary task. But so too as the kind of incentive structures that Tom Noe and Peyton Young talked about in this book, where you can set up a financial product. If you've got any brains as a operator in the market, you can set up a contract where you offer to pay someone 200, 300, 500 basis points above what's ruling in the market, and you do it simply by doing a contract with a derivative that will 19 times out of 20 pay on a reward of £100 put over. 19 times out of 20 you get £5 back, and the 20th time the money is confiscated and given to the other side, and that evens and you can find a contract that works on the weather or some externally generated probability, and you can then simply package this up as if you're presenting to your clients a reputable security, and 19 times out of 20 you look like a good fund manager who pays above market, and you put a sign on your door saying David Vine's Alpha Quality Rewards, and stuff happens in the 20th year and you shut up shop and go and set up down the road with a new name and do it again. And that's very easy to do, and Peyton and Tom in this paper said anyone with any brains would run a hedge fund that way if they had no other obligations and sense of commitment. So there are, in three different ways, there are things that need to be done about incentives described on this page. We think that because of this, the universal bank is a rather difficult institution, I was going to say, to manage well. Put the sentence another way, it's quite hard to see how you can get a well-behaved universal bank. This was put to me by David Morgan, the ex-CEO of Westpac, very successful Australian bank, and I slightly parody what he said, but it was more or less like this, with 11 floors in our building, and on the third floor there were the people who did current accounts and straightforward mortgages and pensions and stuff, straightforward, sort of low to medium rewards, very routine. And up on the 11th floor were the cowboys doing deals, huge rewards. But the trouble is they have lunch together. And after lunch, the people from the third floor come and see me, in a line every day, and they say, can you find us some egregious product that we can sell to people over the telephone and be rewarded with bonuses for doing, because we want to make as much money as the people up there. So that's a story about the need to ring fence, not just for the vicar's reason about balance sheet protection, but also because there's moral contagion within an organisation. We all know how complicated a university is, in which we encounter these kinds of difficult questions all the time, every day, in various ways. And it speaks to the nature of the institutions that we should be seeking to have in the financial sector, we think. Finally, you can see that I'm running two tracks in this story about professionalism. And the track says, first of all, we seek other regarding obligations and a sense of, let me use the word professionalism in carrying them out. But on the other hand, we seek to use incentives in a good way rather than a bad way. And it's quite hard to do both things at the same time. And just tell an old story from the Sandel book to make this point clear. The babysitting circle after school. School finishes at 3. Parents work till 5. There's someone looking after the babies. Please come and get your kids at 5. The parents don't. They're always late. The person providing the service wants to go home, fed up with it. Please, obligation. They don't come. And so finally, in desperation, charge the parents for coming late. And the minute that happens, more parents come late. Why? No longer a moral obligation to come on time. Very difficult to do both at once. And some of the challenges of financial reform are about that difficulty. So here at the personal level, I've been talking about acting in a professional manner with responsibilities of the kind of fair dealing, respecting duties, following codes, with mechanisms that are appropriate, not just salary scales, but safety rules, professional standards, codes of conduct, memberships of organisations, ethics management, and accountability, which involves disciplinary processes, but also looking outwards to society, civil and criminal laws, and peer pressure. Now, you can see this is complicated, and what I've described to you isn't very well pinned down yet, but this is the nature of the research agenda that we think we have on this part of our project. And we're going to do this in 3 or 4 ways. The first way is work that Natalie is going to do with us, essentially about ensuring environments which encourage people to behave well. There's experimental work out there about how reminding people that they're a banker induces them to behave in a less trustworthy way in an experimental game. The very same people who, when you reminded them of their much-loved family, would not behave in that way and answer to questions. So framing seems to matter. But as Natalie has pointed out, it matters more for some people than others. There are some people who rat on their family just as much as a banker would rat on his clients. And so there is experimental work to do on a mixture of these questions of both type of person and framing. And that we're looking forward to Natalie doing work on that. This history of thought that I talked about and the game theory work about the extent to which motivations really are central to this project and the extent to which at a very high level you can push off the claims I've been making today and seek to maintain a view that at the core the individuals in society can be thought of as utterly self-regarding and selfish, and yet you can sustain desirable outcomes. Still something that we need to work on, but opinions differ greatly. And finally, work that Nick is going to do on the way in which there are very different methods of framing in different societies. Framing in this country, we know in the City of London, involved leather armchairs in gentlemen's clubs, and a House of Lords that didn't have positions for sale in it. Religious structures important, and Nick has done a lot of work comparing this with behaviour in China, where there is a process of sustaining obligations to others that's both very important and rather different from something which we know ourselves. You can see that there's you can see our objectives, which I've described to you. Sorry, I'm going the wrong way. Our objectives are to do this, and the methods that we're going to bring about a particular research in thinking about them involve going in that direction involves behavioural research, some economics, and some international comparisons. Over to you, Nick. And we'll swap places.
Well, one of the things that we have come to learn since we last spoke here about a year ago is that, and then we saw the problem as being rather homogenous, and it was a problem which was, we'd sort of got firms and individuals and society all mixed up together. We came to realise that it could only really be, we could only really get an implementation strategy if we separated them and started trying to understand what it was that affected individuals, what it was that affected firms, and what it was that affected society. And so some of the new work is very much about those 3 different levels. Now, of course, the 3 levels interact, and a lot of what you do with firms are your mechanisms for how the employees behave. And a lot of what you do with society affects what then happens in the firms and to the individuals. So each level you go down to has an impact on the previous level. Now, what we're trying to do is to apply what was really the key idea in this book, which was to see how one can implement the four-step strategy, the defining of obligations, setting up of responsibilities, working out what the right mechanisms were, and then how you hold people to account at each of these levels. And in terms of the corporate level, it's quite complicated. And those of you that have read some of the governance literature will see that we've been round and round on trying to work out how you govern firms and how you make directors and trustees and so on do the right things. And what we're working on now, and very much in collaboration with Colin Mayer at Side Business School, and Colin wrote a parallel book which is called Firm Commitment. And Colin's main worry in Firm Commitment is that because we've become very focused on shareholder value over the last 40 years or so, we've forgotten many of the other things that corporations are there for. And we've certainly forgotten the other stakeholders in corporations. And a lot of Colin's work is about how do you, in a sense, wind back this rather excessive focus on shareholder value to something which gives a longer term sustainability to companies. There's again the list of obligations, responsibilities, mechanisms and holding to account for each of these levels, ranging from, in the holding to account, how you increase liability on directors and trustees, how you set up the regulatory penalties, what types of mechanisms we have for making firms behave better. And like David, I'm going to drill down into some of those in the coming slides. Now, we got, both in the book and subsequently, we've got quite concerned about how behaviour in firms, particularly the extraction of capital of assets from firms, was then making the firm unable to pursue its wider corporate purpose. And there are quite a lot of examples in, for example, the development of private equity and a lot of corporate finance, which has led to the stripping out of capital from companies, which has then made them very vulnerable. And we think that part of the process of making firms behave in a more trustworthy way is to remind them of what is needed for their long-term sustainability. We think that the structure of ownership and the governance of firms bear very strongly on their ability to pursue their purpose. And we think that a move away from shareholder value maximisation, which of course is reflected in the remuneration of the employees, is actually necessary to create the required change in individual behaviour. There's quite a lot of work needed on how the directors of companies can make their firms more trustworthy. One of the pieces of research I've been doing the last 3 or 4 years is on Australian superannuation, for example, and there is a serious problem that the boards of trustees are not able or willing to represent the interests of the members adequately. And there's now a call for the forced imposition of a much wider range of independent directors into those funds. We can come back to that in questions if anyone's interested. Importantly, one of the chapters in the book by John Armour and Gordon is about how there is a need to adjust law so that externalities created by firms are fully recognised in the liabilities they then face. Now, I said that the extraction of capital and the sustaining of the commitment of the firm to its purpose are at odds, and there's been a variety of people, Colin Mayer included, who've come up with suggestions about how one fixes that. Colin Mayer has the idea of trust firms. Christopher Stone, writing about 40 years ago, was very concerned about the lack of interest in the wider society by corporate boards, and he came up with the idea of public interest directors being a requirement. For example, there's a variety, and the Swedes have come up with sort of methods of protecting the firm's mission while still rewarding shareholders. So there's rather important work to be done about whether there's something we can do with corporate governance to improve this. In finance, I've certainly come to believe that demutualisation was a mistake, and one of my heroes, John Bogle, believes that very strongly, that this sort of led to the reduction in the interest of the investors. When we were recently, we've been talking with a variety of people, and David mentioned that we talked particularly with Barclays, and Barclays, of course, has gone through a process of seeing what it can do from the top to fix some of the problems that it previously had. And we think that there are, again, 3 levels that are needed. If you've got roles that particularly require trustworthy behaviour, it would be quite a good idea to put people that are trustworthy into those roles. And so one of the things you might do is sort where your employees are. The second thing you need to look at is how you choose which activity you do, including product sales and customer service. And the third is what you expect your individuals to do and what instructions they're given and how they're monitored. Now, that sounds very much like motherhood and apple pie, but it's not being done in most of the firms I know about adequately. Now, there's also quite a lot one can do with the institutional structure of the firm, and David mentioned the issues about ring fencing of different parts of the firm from each other. And we've certainly become very concerned that moral contagion is quite important, and that's not something that was focused on by Vickers, for example. And that probably strengthens the arguments for breaking banks up into component parts. One of the chapters in Capital Failure is written by a professor from the Netherlands who's done a lot of work on ethics management and sort of what you can and can't do to nudge people in the direction of more trustworthy behaviour. And the Netherlands have introduced, for example, a banker's code, which is equivalent maybe to the doctor's Hippocratic Oath, and do believe they're getting some traction with reminding people what their obligations are. But they've also been trying to do quite a lot of work on educating people with sort of repetitive polls, or trying to ask them, how would you behave in these circumstances? Badly. Do you realise that that's badly? And so on. And they find that that does have some impact on how people subsequently behave. So there may be some value in this ethics management. When we were writing the book, and in the last chapter, we had a look at some other industries. And one of the things that puzzled us was, why is it, for example, that a complicated industry like aircraft engines, Airbus can rely on Rolls-Royce to produce an engine that won't blow up in the middle of the sky, whereas the pension fund cannot rely on Goldman Sachs to produce a product that won't blow up. What is it that's different between the two industries? And we got quite interested in that question. The best answer we could come up with was that the people making the aero engines cared about making aero engines, whereas the focus of the Goldman Sachs is money, and particularly their money. But in the various industries we looked at, there's been some achievement of standards that sort of come from within the industries. The obvious ones are the industries which are recognised as professions, and law and medicine have had a long history of self-regulation. But there are industries such as nuclear and chemical which have faced a crisis, responded, and then created systems for themselves which have led to better behaviour.
Did you include the motor industry in that one?
The
vehicle industry.
The vehicle industry. Well, this was all written before the Volkswagen story, which of course we need to adjust. Both the nuclear and chemical, the 3 Mile Island and Bhopal, they had a similar sort of crisis, and their reaction was rapid, and they did not want government to intervene and regulate them, so they tried to regulate themselves with some success. Whether this will now happen with motor, I don't know, but motor's all fairly recent. But there are examples. We got quite interested in the New York Diamond Exchange, for example. There are problems with diamonds that they're quite small, so you can steal them quite easily, and they might be blood diamonds, and yet somehow it's rare for diamonds to be stolen in the New York Diamond Exchange, and they're not, and they nowadays don't trade in blood diamonds, or at least we don't know they do. And we discovered in that case that it's rather ferocious holding to account that the Jewish community will shun you if you, and you'll never work again if your peers notice that you're behaving like this. And if there's even a suggestion that you're behaving badly, your name is put up on the end of the entrance to the dining room. So it's a bit like not being allowed into the Pall Mall clubs, it's the same sort of thing. But there it does seem that there's a community effect. So I won't read these out, but these are words where we're trying to relate corporate matters to our 4-part framework. Now, what are we going to try and do in this area? We've divided it into 3 parts. The first is very much drawing on Colin's work, governance. The second, disaggregation, the different subsectors, and the third, ethics management. Under governance, we looking at how shareholder value maximisation can be adjusted to eventually align the interests of financial institutions with society and supporting a wider range of stakeholders. And the methodology for doing that is exploring the corporate anthropology of firms that have enabled trustworthy outcomes and understanding successes and failures, developing ideas set out in firm commitment. In the second part, we are trying to explore the different parts of the financial services industry, working out which activities require what level of trust. So doctors and pension fund managers need to be more trustworthy than those selling simple, easily understood products, and the mechanisms that are available to us to adjust for trustworthiness will vary. Holding to account does require different systems for different activities, and we've begun to explore how different aspects can be made more trustworthy. And this table, which I'm not going to read out, but is a beginning of trying to understand that for, in this case, 4 different types of financial activity, ranging from basic banking through insurance, long-term savings, corporate support and trading, and the various, but again using our 4-part framework as an organising methodology for how one thinks about those matters. I was interested to read in Tony Atkinson's book on inequality. He expresses the opinion that we should just let the government run 75% of financial services because they're simple enough and don't require anything very clever, and that might be a way of fixing some of the problems. So he's got a rather extreme version of ring fencing. We'll just hand it back to the government. Under ethics management, we think that exploring how remuneration systems can be adjusted is rather important. In Barclays, they're experimenting, I think it's fair to say still experimenting, with something called the Barclays scorecard, and they're genuinely linking their remuneration to things other than just simple financial return, so that there is at least some recognition of how things are done as well as what is done. We do think it's very important to remove incentive to supply risky products to clients, and that removing the asymmetry in compensation schemes. There's been some work on trying to develop deferred bonuses, but not deferred for very long. And in David's example, it's a 20-year process. So it may well be that the deferring just for 5 years is not enough. I wondered about linking it to their pensions, but that would be a quite dramatic activity. And of course, we need to explore the Netherlands experience and others on whether we can do something formal with ethics management. I said that there were 3 levels. So we're now moving on to the level of society. And by society, I mean government, and I mean what is it that the body politic can do to. And so here we're setting up again the same set of questions about what the obligation of society is, what the responsibilities of society are, what kinds of mechanisms society has, and how society is held to account. And we've sort of felt that this boils down to the legal and regulatory framework, and so in this section we're very much focusing on the legal and regulatory framework. But I'll just start with a few comments about the macroeconomic implications. The first macroeconomic implication is that we need a well-functioning financial system to make it possible for productive firms to obtain long-term commitment of funds. But poor trust outcomes prevent this happening. And the increasing regulatory burden imposing trustworthy behaviour by rule appears in danger of making the problem worse. And then the second set of problems is that if we don't trust the financial services industry, we're not going to save as much. We need to be able to trust in the future behaviour of the financial system in order to make the necessary savings, which will then create the investments that are needed for economic development. This is getting more and more important because we have a larger ageing population, so funding pensions and long-term care is very important. And if we persuade people that there's no way they can save without their money being stolen, then we won't get as much saving, and then we'll have more of a problem with pensions and long-term care in the future. Everything, we think, requires an effective legal and regulatory system, and what we've been focusing on during the past year is what that might be and how it might be developed. And we've got another of our diagrams where we're trying to define what it is that the legal and regulatory system does relating to our four steps. Very important role of the law is to define what's right and what's wrong. So a very important role in the obligations category is providing guidance. But it also defines responsibilities by establishing duties, etc. And then it has most of the mechanisms which can be used by society to create trustworthiness. I've been getting very interested in which of all the legal systems of the world are most effective in creating a trustworthy outcome, and been looking at the relative power of common law, civil law, religious law, and technocratic administrative law. And what we're intending to do, started doing, is identify which legal systems are the most effective, which then may give us some guidance as to what sort of legal reforms might be effective in future. Because I work a lot in China, I've got very interested in whether we can learn much from China. And as David said earlier, I do believe there's quite a lot to learn from China. I'm coming back to that. In the book, there's about 4 chapters which focus on the problems which we have with UK law, and particularly with the erosion of duties of various kinds that are in the law, and the way they've been eclipsed, as one of our authors puts it, by the dominance of contract. And many of the problems that we saw in the financial crisis, people said that well-informed investors were agreeing to something, and that therefore meant that we didn't have any duty towards them, even if we told them lies or created products which hurt them. So some activity to strengthen fiduciary duties we think is important. Now, I said that I was getting interested in China, and so I've been reading a bit more of Confucius and what he said. And interestingly, Confucius said almost exactly what we said in our book, but he said it a few thousand years earlier. And he very much believed that a sustainable society didn't require law, but did require trustworthy relationships between people, and he called that Li. And an ideal society in the Confucian world is one in which we all behave towards each other in a trustworthy manner, because we know that that's what will lead to the best outcomes for everybody in the future. And a lot of Chinese tradition is actually based on that idea, and Guanxi is the sort of modern version of Confucian Li. Unfortunately, even in China, they found that some people didn't behave like that, and so the Confucian Fa and the development by the emperors and mandarins of a really rather complicated codified law, which was called Fa, dates back at least to the 8th century BC, was the attempt to overlay onto Li something which then controls for the psychopaths and the people who were unable to do Li. Now, I think we can learn from sort of what has happened in China. That's something we're hoping to develop. We've been very concerned that regulation, as practiced up to the financial crisis, and it didn't work very well. And we're concerned that just having more of it may not work either. So we've been very concerned that the sort of so our research is going into what roles regulation can play in enhancing trustworthiness and the reforms that are needed to enable it to do so. So I'm nearly finished. So we've got outcomes from applying the four-part framework at the level of society give us the obligations, responsibilities, mechanisms and holding to account of society. And you'll see what we're doing is we're trying to define these systematically at each of the levels and relate them to each other. In our work strands for this section of the work, we're going to put a lot of effort into understanding how the legal system enhances trustworthiness and continuing the work we've been doing on exploring the attributes of different legal systems using the four-part framework, identifying which countries have a good experience of trustworthy outcomes and why, and then linking this to the legal and regulatory traditions of countries and societies. And we are hoping to have a specific focus on China, and we've been having some preliminary discussions with Chinese institutions, Peking University, colleges in China, which may lead to some joint work between us and the Chinese. And we're also intending in this area to look rather carefully at the regulatory system, looking at whether some alternative regulatory intervention can help with trustworthiness as our main goal. Those of you that know me know that I've spent most of my life doing regulation, but not of financial services, mostly of utilities, where there has been some success in regulating admittedly simpler industries, but whether there are some of the lessons from that regulatory tradition that can be carried across price control, control of quality, etc., can be carried across into this industry. In some areas, regulators have been quite successful in setting guidance and being a catalyst for better behaviour in their industries. And the question as to whether regulation can be a trust enhancer through leadership about types of product, and then also whether self-regulation by the industry is in fact something that failed and we should forget it, or whether it's necessary. So we've got those four different things that we will be looking at. So just to summarise where we are so far, in the book, In Capital Failure, we articulated a four-part framework for establishing trustworthiness, and this now provides the organising framework for our subsequent work. Obligations, responsibilities, mechanisms, holding to account. And we're operating at three levels on how to encourage professionalism at the individual level, how to reform corporate governance to reduce the adverse effects of shareholder value focus and adverse incentives in different parts of the financial industry, and how to establish a stronger legal and regulatory framework focused on trust. Thank you very much.